Welcome to another episode of GUR Cafe. I'm your host, Lainey Dixon. As I'm sure you saw, clicking on the title of this episode, we're talking day in the life. Getting into GUR can be intimidating as it's often difficult to know what really games user researchers are doing on their day to day behind closed doors, which is in part due to NDAs. But with this new series of Day in the Life, I hope to share a bit more behind the scenes. So, to kick this series off, in today's episode, I'm joined by Tristan Carreiro-Blanc and Gabrielle Mourra, both of whom are games user research analysts, actually on my team here at Ubisoft Montreal. They have a lot of great perspective to share in their experience of getting into games and their first years working as analysts in the domain, as well as their day to day. We have a lot to talk about, so grab your favorite drink and let's jump right into today's episode. Tristan, Gab, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
Hey.
Very excited for today. Very excited to have two guests on. Um, yeah, first of all, please, Tristan, can you kick us off? Introduce yourself to our
Yeah.
listeners.
Yes. So, hi, Tristan. I've been working essentially with Lainey for the past 4 years now. I come from a psychology background. I completed a bachelor's degree there, and from the moment I finished my bachelor's, I was already hooked on working in the video game industry. I had done a thesis on video games in the workplace. So when I got the job, I was super happy. I started as a
I
moderator.
didn't know that you did that. Your thesis was that.
Yeah, I did a thesis during my bachelor's
My
degree
bad.
on video games and how they can help with recovery after a hard day of work. So that was really cool. Since we've been working together, I did a year as a moderator or observer, depending on who you ask. And now I've been a user researcher for the past 3 years, almost 3 years.
Well, thank you, Tristan. Gab, hi. Introduce
Yes.
yourself.
Hello. My name is Gabrielle. I'm also a user researcher at Ubisoft. I started working in video games about a year ago, over a year ago at Ubisoft. But my background, like Tristan, I did my bachelor's in psychology. Did not do my thesis in video games. I did it in neuropharmacology on heroin addiction. So quite different. And then I did a master's in marketing. I did not know that I wanted to work in video games in the beginning. I just knew that I wanted to use psychology in a business context. I've always loved video games, and when I saw the opportunity to work in user research in video games, I jumped on it. So very happily, in the past year and some, almost a year and a half now, we've
Yeah.
been working together, and yeah, I think that's pretty much it
Yeah,
on my
very
end.
cool. Psychology, bachelors of psychology represent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining. I think this is what I hope to be the first in a series of kind of day in the life kind of episodes. I think that I get a lot of questions personally. I know I wondered a lot before I got into the industry. What does it actually mean to be working as a user research analyst? Like, what does that look like? What are my day to day tasks? Because I think from a very like theoretical level, right? We all understand research, we understand the process, we understand kind of what that looks like, but then maybe taking that and mapping that into what does it actually mean to do that with games, I think can sometimes feel a little bit difficult. And so really want to think about some questions that we get a lot from students and those kind of looking to get into the industry about what the day to day looks like on the job. So I'm very excited to have both of you here, two analysts on my team. So thank you very much, and talking a little bit about what you guys do. So I'm going to provide a little bit of relevant background for the listeners as we're kind of going to be doing maybe some different profiles with these day in the life episodes, but For everyone listening, both of you work as embedded researchers. So we've talked about embedded researchers in the past. So these are ones that are working very directly with the production teams. Both Tristan and Gab work and have worked with a variety of different productions, but mostly you're embedded, you're really working specifically with that one production, which does shape a lot your day to day. But this largely means that you do have that opportunity to dig a bit deeper into the relationships and the research because of your proximity. As our offices are opening up again, you guys are able to be seated physically next to the designers, next to the decision makers. They're dancing, they're excited.
Yay.
And I think that does shape you, like specifically for you two, that does shape a bit kind of what your day to day kind of looks like. So yeah, I want to talk a little bit about your jobs as analysts, since the majority of your job really would be running research, which seems logical, right? But I want to talk a little bit about like maybe what running a user test can look like when you're working as an embedded researcher. So with that, one of the most specific questions that pops up a lot is kind of how do you decide what are the most important aspects of UX to start with when testing? And I think this comes a lot from people that are thinking much more theoretical side of research, right? Is that there's a lot of interesting problem spaces, a lot of interesting questions to ask. And obviously, as researchers, we know that there are just so many important topics to evaluate in the game development process. But when it comes to planning a test and deciding a focus, I think students are often, or those kind of outside, are often left wondering, like, how do you prioritize something if it's between menu UX and design of a mission, or character design and environment design? So Tristan, I'm going to have you kick things off and talk a little bit about what the process can actually look like. And maybe when you're in those early planning stages, how you actually decide what and when to test.
All right. So when and what to test, prioritization strategy. It's a, like you said, complex thing. When I started, uh, it was the main thing that was on my mind, working with the team I was with. So, um, it's very tempting to just say, oh, okay, I'm going to be testing this. I'm going to be putting that in the player's hands. I'm going to get feedback. I'm going to help the team. But essentially, what I learned quickly is that um, your priorities have to be in line with the production's priorities and what is important for them to get insights or feedback on, and what can wait a little bit longer before providing that to them. So, um, main thing to do with as an embedded researcher when we're on the production itself, main thing or first thing to do is really get an understanding of what's your team's timeline. What are they looking at? What's the amount of time they have to work on the different features, the content, the game they're working on, and also at each of those different steps, what is going to be their focus and what level of quality they would like to have each of those features at. So let's say you arrive on production very, very early, and they're just brainstorming on different concepts and designs, and they just want to see if people like are interested in those kinds of designs, interested in those kinds of concepts. Usability might not be the thing you want to get feedback on. So really focusing on what they need first, and then planning out maybe further down the line what is going to be interesting and when.
I think it's also interesting of thinking about like, okay, so you were saying like I arrive early on a production and they're working on a lot of different things. I think it can be very tempting to be like, oh, I want to do this, I want to do this, I want to do this. There's a lot of interesting things. And so finding that balance is always going to be really important. Gab, I know you had something to add.
Yes. So definitely super important to consider the context of your production team and where they're at in their timeline. So usually we do, right, ask them and try to understand what they need, but sometimes we can realize priorities based on previous tests, previous research, that certain things are important based on what we've seen players' feedback have that might not be in the priorities vision or prior the production team, sorry, vision or priorities at the moment. And so we can challenge it. Sometimes we can show them, look, these are the facts, these are what we're seeing. We definitely think that this should be addressed eventually in one of the tests. So we can have those conversations. So it's not always just coming from them, but it's always very important. It's not, academic research is kind of like you own the show, you decide what you're researching, like you have this vision, but here it's really a collaboration and you have to really take into consideration your stakeholders.
Yeah, I like that you pointed out like it's a collaboration because I think that that is it's very easy to get lost in like look at all these interesting topics and like when we know that maybe something is a problem, right, like you were saying, Gab, you can kind of come back and say like okay, like maybe we've seen some issues in past tests and maybe we need to push like hey, like maybe this isn't a priority for you right now but maybe it should be, and we can kind of leverage that. And so I do think the key word is really kind of the collaboration between the two. And I think being embedded allows you to leverage those relationships in a really meaningful and interesting way.
Mm. I wanted to jump on that subject. If you, if at some point you want to bring up an option or an idea or a specific uh, piece of research that the productions should be interested in, it's very important to inform them on why it should be important to them and really
100%.
make them understand uh, why putting some focus on this aspect of the game will benefit them further down the line. And,
Yeah,
and
I think that's a big part of it because I think that it's it's very easy to fall into a trap of like, here's my findings, do things. And it's kind of making sure that it is double checking and making sure that you're not getting to the phase of delivering a report and everyone's like, cool. Because that never feels good. It never feels good when you've delivered something that you feel like I did a great job, I delivered really interesting findings, and then they're kind of just like, this isn't what we needed, it wasn't what we wanted right now, this doesn't help us with anything. And so you do kind of have to find that middle ground of like, maybe this is something, and I know I've had this conversation with both of you in the past of how do we leverage, hey, we know this is going to be a problem, but it wasn't necessarily something that the team asked us for initially, and kind of navigating that space. And again, we've talked about it before on past podcast episodes, but communication is huge, and being able to kind of have that open communication with your collaborators and thinking through like how do we recognize what needs to be tested and when, and right. And I think you guys really nailed it. It's that it's often a conversation, and sometimes it can be, we've all been in situations, everybody here, where we said, all right, well, we're actually going to do this research because we really know that it's going to be really important for you, even though you can't really see it. But like you said, Tristan, it's being able to say like the context of why, right? And why is this something we feel that's going to help them take a decision or have comfort in validation of a decision, and finding the balance between validating, right? And being able to kind of help drive that decision making process.
really quickly, I think that every new researcher has fallen into that trap of going to the what would be interesting in providing and then being super proud of their report and then presenting it to have it met with, oh, okay, well, we don't really need that. And like you said, uh, it's let's say hurtful a little bit, putting all that effort for nothing in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody here, I think we can all agree that we've been in that situation, right? I think I know for me, I've been in that situation when I was first getting started. You feel very passionately about like, I know that I should do this thing and I'm going to research that, I'm going to deliver this findings and it's going to be amazing and they're going to like it's going to be the best thing ever. And so yeah, it is being able to make sure that you're getting that context. And I think it's a hard lesson for a lot of people to learn when you're moving from a very kind of theoretical to more kind of the applied side of things. Obviously, there are other jobs and there are jobs within our lab that are very based on theoretical research, and that's the case for a lot of research teams. But it's finding that flexibility when you're working embedded and you're kind of planning that can help you feel that you're delivering good work, right? Because I think it does fight that iteration black box of being able to say, we delivered something and they acted on it and I saw them and I saw it be able to come into action, because that feels the most like rewarding thing when you're able to deliver for a decision that needs to be made. Because if you're just delivering interesting findings but is never insightful and helping drive a decision, it starts to feel really demotivating in your job. And I think a lot of that does come back to kind of initially what you were both chatting about, is kind of understanding the needs, understanding the questions, what's our roadmap, what's our priorities.
Yeah, I would like to add to that actually, because we're talking a lot about actionability, which makes me think about the fact that, how we ask and how we communicate is very important here. So we could ask them, what do you want to, like, in the sense, like, what data do you want? So they could be like, okay, we want to know how much they're dying, and we want to know how much, they say they like the game. But it's like, really, we need to understand more. So what decisions do they need to be making? Because they can tell us they want this data, but we're not always aligned on how to interpret data. So for them,
Yes.
what death means versus for us, what the death of your character means. Like what we can infer from that, what we can understand about their experience varies. So it's not about asking them, okay, what do you want? It's really more about like what decisions do you need to make? What are your timelines? What's going on? Like where are you at in your process, and what needs to be figured out now? Instead of just asking them what data they want. I think that's a very
Yeah.
important nuance when we want to make sure everything's actionable.
Yeah. And it's the difference between like I'm data driven versus I'm data informed.
Yeah.
And making sure that you're not just selecting data that's like doesn't provide the context, right? We see this all the time where everyone's like, oh, we want the telemetry data, we want the tracking data. And it's like, this is wonderful. And this is an amazing tool, an amazing asset that we'll be able to bring in our research, but it can't be that alone. And so being able to kind of tie in, and again, yeah, understanding when they ask, like, oh, well, we want to know how many times the player died right here. Is that really what they needed to know, or was that the question and we kind of have to work backwards from that to be able to derive what the actual question is? And maybe it's, do they understand where they're supposed to go, so they're dying because they can't actually advance? Is it because they didn't understand the enemy, they weren't able to locate them, right? It's like there's a whole host of actually specific research questions. And so that needs gathering process is so important to kind of work your way kind of almost backwards from that.
Yep.
So proud of you guys. All right, I'm going to move to the next question because it's kind of the next steps, right? So talking about the needs gathering process, which is super important, always something I'm chatting about with all of you and our entire team, is really making sure we're communicating, understanding the needs, understanding the timeline, because it also shapes when and how we deliver. But let's talk about, okay, you've established the needs, you understand what the objectives, you understand when you're going to be running this test. Gab, can you share a bit about kind of the lead up to a test, right? So you've already have something planned on the calendar, but like when does preparation begin? What does that preparation process typically look like for you?
So when the preparation begins will definitely depend on the complexity of a test, and also just the timeline, right? Because sometimes you may be having tests back to back because, again, we're in a business context. Things can be moving much faster than an academic contest. We need answers quickly, right? So I'm going to say a typical, let's say a usability test that's pretty simple. We can start maybe just a few weeks before. We start so we know high level what they want to know. And so then we talk to the specific designers who worked on the different features that we might be studying to get a deep understanding of what the feature is, what is their design intention. So how should the feature be experienced by the player? And also, what are their hypotheses? Do they have any ideas of things that might be going wrong? So we get really a good idea of like what is the actual game content that we will be testing, but also, okay, what decisions do you need to be making about these features? Are you thinking between two different things? Are you wondering like, is it, like overpowered, or like, what are the decisions that you need to be making? Is it more like the visual design, the balancing, like really just understanding where we're at and where they need to go and what's missing to get there. So basically, once we've done that process, that can take quite a while depending, like usually it's iterative. So you'll have your first meeting, Sometimes it's a feature you're not familiar with at all. And so you have to go through the design documents and you think you have everything you need to know. Then you have to call
You
them
never
back and
do.
be like, yeah. You're like, hey, so I thought I had everything, but I didn't. So it's really important to be comfortable asking questions, right? You can't know what you don't know until the gap appears.
I think that's
Um,
so key though, and I'm gonna stay on that for a second because I think it's staying curious. And I say this to everyone who's like, oh, the needs gathering process is very daunting and this and that. It's just user research. It's just your users are different. Your user in your audience is your designers, and you're asking questions. You're using the same techniques that you would use in the test room on the design floor. And you have to be very comfortable in asking questions, and it's unrealistic to expect that you know the ins and outs of every single feature that you're about to test. And that's okay. Like nobody expects you to be perfect.
exactly. So yeah, definitely. I put my phone on silent. Sorry about that. But yeah, definitely like feel free to ask questions. No one does expect you to know everything. Like it's um, not realistic because games can be very complex. They might seem simple on the outside, but there's so many moving parts, so you really try to get that understanding as much as possible. Once you get that understanding of what needs to be um, answered, then you start writing up your high level research objectives, followed by there's sub research questions that make that research objective. And we usually also afterwards speak to the team again just to confirm, like, because it's really important here to align on expectations. We want to make sure that they know what answers they're going to be getting and that those are the answers they want, right? So we're not talking here about how you're getting the answers. We're talking about what questions overall you will be answering in the reports, for example. So once we all agree on that, we can start working on the methods. So we decide, like, based on what we're studying, what's the best method to get the results. We also need to keep in mind, so right during the needs gathering, we'll also get a vision of like, when do you need these answers? Because that
Yep.
can impact the methods. So
Yeah.
if we need to be really quick, we're not going to do a diary study. You know what I mean? Uh, so depending on how quickly they need the results, we also modify as much as possible the methods. Depending on where we're at in production, we might do just an internal test, right, with people that work in the company, um, and not with external participants, which can also be faster. So, there's a lot of context specific things that will tell you like how you're going to run the research, but then there's also like, okay, the research questions will also guide you in determining what methods would be the most appropriate to find those answers. So you make the design of the test, you work on the tools. Usually by tools, I mean, anything that you're creating to get feedback from players, whether it's interviews, surveys, anything like that. And then we usually try to have a few people look at that because these documents where when you're writing something, it makes sense. You have all this context and all this knowledge about the game, and you're like, yeah, this is so obvious. And then you give it to someone, they're like, what is this question? So really, it's we collaborate as much as possible to give each other feedback on these things as quickly as possible. And once we've like validated all of that, we prepare. Oh, I didn't mention recruitment, but like there's so many moving pieces. Like
Yeah,
we have checklists because there's so much, especially, like I recommend having a list of what you need to do because there's so much going on. And then you're collaborating with a lot of people that need different information from you. Plus you're doing your own stuff on the side. So it's like you really need to keep track of a lot of things. So there's
the
like preparing the recruitment. Tristan, I don't know if there's some stuff I forgot you want to talk about.
you have pretty much explained a lot of what we do for the preparation of a test. But like you were saying just at the end about recruitment, like there are so many things to do and also so many people to talk with. During preparation, you were talking about getting informed about the design. Well, we talk to designers, we talk to directors. Sometimes there are project managers or project owners into that also have their questions, that also have their concerns, their doubts, challenges, and it's discussing about all of them, like trying to really identify what they need, like you were saying, to make those decisions and what kind of insights they need right now. Moreover, like for everything that you explained, that was like directly what we as researchers have to do. Like we have to communicate and coordinate with other people, like moderators or observers or recruiters, like you were mentioning. Coordinators on their side, they have to see if they have the resources, if they have the time, if it comes into conflict with another test that is, or another piece of research that is planned at the lab, at the studio. Um, and then it's constant back and forth with all of these people. Tech coordinators also making sure that the builds are readily installed, that everything is working, there's no connectivity issues. Um, a lot of back and forth is essentially what I was trying to get to with multiple different people. And even when everything, all that is done, there's still like you have to go back to designers, the directors, so on and so forth.
It's a lot of managing expectations. It's a lot of ensuring that people have what they need. And I think, too, keeping into consideration kind of our lab structure and kind of, you were saying like, got to make sure it doesn't clash with another test that's on the schedule. Like, we're covering a lot of different productions. Like the two of you work with different teams. We have a lot of researchers that are working on a lot of different projects, and we're all kind of coordinating that. We have coordinators, thank God, thank the coordinators that are able to manage a lot of that. And so, yeah, I mean, imagine if you didn't have all of these people trying to go through all of those steps. Obviously, it creates extra kind of work for you all to coordinate when you do have the moderators, or as well as coordinators. Thank goodness we have tech coordinators and people on our side, because obviously, in the world of remote testing, we've had to adapt a lot of kind of how we actually do the research with the players. And so, yeah, it's a lot of I think a lot of people are often surprised at the level of kind of like project management or like coordination there is. It's not just like I'm doing research every day and it's beautiful. It's like, yeah, of course, that's super exciting. And it is a big part of it, but there is also managing the expectations of those that are assisting you with the research, making sure they understand what you're trying to do. Again, going back to your stakeholders, making sure like, did I understand your needs correctly? We've had a lot of conversations. I've looked at the content. Do what I'm proposing to give to you at this point, like, is that helpful? And sometimes between that initial conversation and that conversation, they're like, actually, we need the results in like 2 days, not 2 weeks. And you're like, oh, okay. Yeah, let me just completely change everything. No problem. So the test is prepped, right? There's obviously a lot of things that we need to prepare. But I think something that's kind of interesting is, all right, you've done a lot of the coordination, you've done a lot of the management. What does running a test look like? What kind of help do you have? Who are you working with? What are you kind of doing when that test is happening? Tristan, what can you provide me some insights on that?
So running a test. Again, I think it's pretty in line with the previous step of preparation where there's still a lot of communication coordination with different people. So on one end, there are communications and coordinations with the coordination team, since they're the ones managing the participants, making sure that they're there on time, that everybody's up to date, they have the filed documents they need. Um, Coordinating with the moderators that are going to be running the test, making sure that everything's working on their end. They have everything they need, so especially at the beginning of a test. The first day is always the most stressful one. Uh, Everything can break at the last minute. So up until that moment, stress, anxiety is at its peak. And then
Even
after the
then,
first hour, usually after the first hour,
Even
it
after
goes
like
back
3 years, you're just like, oh God, please work.
Yes. Especially if you're working, if you changed productions ever like regularly, like I did, you never know like what kind of new issues can arise with the new production. So maybe on the last one, a specific thing was problematic on the first day. Well, maybe this new one, that specific thing's not going to be a problem, but something else. So always have to be adapting on the fly for running user tests. Other than coordination, I think that a major part of what we do is, well, except looking at the test and making sure that everything's running well, is starting to look at different kinds of data that you can already get your hands on. Gab, I don't know if you want to start talking about the like running a test
Analysis?
actually. What?
I said analysis. What?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I definitely agree with everything you said, as usual. Um, but I, for me, it's like out of all the parts of the test, when the test is actually running and is running smoothly, I always feel like that's when I'm most at ease. Like, let's say there hasn't been any problems, like everything's working, the build's working, all the participants showed up, there's no issues. That is the calm moment where you're just like, I just rushed to get everything ready. After this, I'm going to be rushing to get things analyzed. So this is the part where I'm like slowly trying to get a sense of like the players, there, as you said, the data. Um, Now, when things don't go well, it's a lot of troubleshooting. As you were saying, issues with builds and that from production to production because the builds are made differently. Um, like we'll have different problems, but what's good about staying on a production for a while, or if you know people who have been on that production, it's always important to know like, okay, when we see these issues that are known issues, how do we fix them? What are the like either cheats or like just different techniques? Is it just like a restart and everything's fixed? Like what's the process? You kind of prepare yourself for that, or you hopefully prepare yourself for that. Not always. um, and sometimes you just gotta like drop everything, and your focus is on fixing anything something that's broken, and that's really again collaboration. Staying, like even if you're analyzing and things are going smoothly, keeping an eye on what's happening, just checking in from time to time, having a like designated person to contact you. So it's like, because sometimes there's a lot of chatter, just like, oh, this player did this, this, like I don't know, but it's like you want to be able to focus on the right stuff, and so like having a process, like okay, if I'm going to be on mute, you need me, tag me, like, so there's ways of doing that, and you learn what works for you with time. But yeah, like basically either everything's chill and I'm analyzing as much as I can before the test ends. Because sometimes also we might realize like, oh, I was not expecting this. I should probably ask about this before the test ends so you can pivot, right? Like so you have to be very adaptable.
Yep.
Like it can be very scary and stressful at first because especially for someone like me who likes to have everything like planned and like this is how it's gonna be and 1, 2, 3 and like that's how it's gonna go. Like and then it's like, nope, that's not real
But I
life.
think but I think that's such an important thing to add because I know that you brought up that was something that was challenging, but I think it's something that's very challenging for a lot of people coming in is being able to embrace the uncertainty of not being able to expect every single thing. Sometimes, like you both mentioned, there is a build or a certain production where like known issues, right? So we launch the build, we enter some cheats, we're able to kind of carry on with our day. Sometimes things just implode and we can't anticipate it. And I think one of the hallmarks of kind of more experienced and good researchers is being able to embrace the fact that, like, okay, shit's going to go bad. How do I manage to still deliver insights? How do I pivot? How can I remain flexible? How do I adapt? And can I so it's basically trying to find that kind of happy medium of like, do I just cancel? Do I just like completely abandon ship and say, all right, we can't do anything with this? Or how do I kind of adjust, right? And I think that that's where it's very challenging for you as an analyst because you have to be keeping an eye on all of these different things and also being able to think on the fly of, okay, that thing didn't work means I can't answer this objective. What do I do? Can I do something? Okay. Okay, everybody tell your players to go do this thing instead, or we're going to add this question later, or you know what? Never mind. We're not going to go fight that boss. Go do something else. Like, everybody hurry, get out of that area. And you're like trying to kind of orchestrate everything. I think that's a really important piece of the role of being able to say, things didn't go according to plan. How do I still deliver something meaningful? And sometimes it's, hey, sorry team, we weren't able to get what you needed because the build didn't work or we weren't able to meet the objectives. But more often it's, all right, that thing didn't work and we're going to follow up next time on that, but what we can tell you is this.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say like this talk is bringing back so many memories from like me 3 years ago, from the more challenging aspects, but also the more enjoyable elements. Like I had completely forgotten. Also, it shows that it has been a very long time that I've done an external test. But yeah, what you were saying, that that moment of peace when everything is rolling, I got a flashback. And I was like, that is so true. And everything is just running smoothly. There's a moment where you just, ah, this is nice. And you just, between that stress of coordination and starting it to analyze, there's always that period of like, I want to see what's happening in my test. And then looking at the players running around, trying stuff out, completing the tutorials. And that's really enjoyable. But also, like you were saying, Lainey, we have to stay adaptable. We have to adapt to the situations that we're in. Sometimes, like the stress of do I cancel a meeting, not a meeting, a test or not? That has happened in the past, and early me struggled a lot with that. Um, Really
I think
understanding
I think
what can
it's
I do.
difficult for a lot of newcomers to be able to problem solve in that capacity because it's so stressful because you feel like you failed.
Yes, and especially when you can't change or you can't like use this test as an opportunity to get feedback or insights on another aspect of the game that wasn't planned. That's even more. The word you said earlier was like demotivating. So yeah, really want to hit on that.
I'd like to add, like, I think a big part of like, so, like sometimes things will break. Let's say like the game, everything works normally in the game, but it just keeps crashing every 30 minutes. We will expect players to be frustrated and pissed off. Okay. Because it's like every 30 minutes, they're like, I was doing something, it crashed. Like, so there are ways for us to consider like the impact. It's like we think like, okay, so this is, let's say I am studying difficulty, right? Like, will this crash be impacting difficulty? Depending on the game, it might not, right? So it's like, all right, is like my main focus impacted? If so, how much? Like, is it just a little bit impacted where I'm like, okay, like people's like appreciation of the game is gonna be worse because they're frustrated. And we can actually plan to ask players like, how much do you think this contributed? Like, if you're not considering, the fact that the build was not stable or whatnot, um, do you still feel so you can, work around certain things? But sometimes like
Yeah.
if the main focus is like, do they like the design and like all the colors are out of whack, then you're like, okay, I should probably cancel this.
Yeah, but I think it's important, right, to be able to think and you have to really know your objectives and this
Yeah.
is when it really comes back to like I was really I'm a stickler for the needs gathering. I'm a stickler for the prep, because I think it's being able to identify like very quickly how much of an impact is this going to have on those objectives? Can I still deliver on something? What are my priorities? If you know the priority level of the different objectives you have and like prio 4 is being impacted, you can just abandon and just say, you know what, we're just not going to do that because we're still getting those primary core pieces that the team needs. And or you're just like, all right, well, we're going to try and go ahead anyways. And like you said, maybe we'll ask them some questions. We'll try and work around it, right? It's like not everything's going to be perfectly controlled and scientific, but sometimes we just have to act on our feet a little bit and still be able to get some feedback.
Yeah. I would add to that just quickly, disclaimers. Use disclaimers when you think something has been impacted. Just write in your study, like, look, these are the things that happened. We had these issues. We think it impacted the results in this way. And that's fair, right?
Yeah. Yeah, being able to just to say like, hey, so, the game didn't behave as we all expected it to. And so, how do we still work around that? And a lot of the times it's we're still delivering those findings and we're checking them all again in the future, right? Because we're not just going to run some disaster one time and just be like, hey, here's your findings, we're going to move. It's that what we can say based on what we had, here is some findings, 99% of the time we're going to say, hey, we recommend once things are stable and once we can address these problems that came up, we want to reevaluate. And then we're going to use those findings as our hypotheses running into the next test. And we've already kind of got that prep ready, right? And so that's usually when you end up in back-to-back test situations, is you're just kind of one thing to the next. Here's our findings. We've addressed it. We're going to the next thing. So you both mentioned kind of analysis, right? Because obviously, like test week or test times, whether it's a couple of days, a few weeks, a month, whatever, depending on the type of test. There's obviously a period of analyzing, which is a nice quiet time where you can sit and analyze and think about things. I want to talk a little bit about reporting. Kind of, all right, you gathered the needs, you've run the test, you've analyzed. What do we do with this information? You know, what does a reporting process look like, or kind of how do you go about giving those findings back to your stakeholders? Gab, thoughts?
Yes. So reporting. Reporting can be a stressful process, especially when you're new, right? Because it's like a lot of data, and you might be tempted to report everything. Don't do it. Honestly,
Thank
usually the
you. I feel like we've had this
speaking.
conversation.
I think we've all had that conversation at some
Yes.
point with someone.
Someone who? What? Not me. But yeah, I think it's like, we tend to like hold on to this idea of like the more I give, the more likely like you probably want all the information. But like designers, like their whole job isn't like reading our reports. So they have a lot going on. We want to give them uh, the main things that they need to know and digestible like pieces. So like we're going to focus on the main priorities, make sure that all those priorities are answered. It doesn't mean like, like let's say the question is, do people like the game? Maybe I don't have to say all the things that people like about the game in my answer. I can give like people said they like the game. The main reasons why people liked it was this, this, and this. Let's say, right? For example, um, no need to talk about everything. We just have to actually answer the priority question with the priority information. So like really thinking about like what do people need to know, not everything that is there. Um, Now there's also, besides the priorities, the research priorities, we have the pain points or big problems that showed up that we were not expecting. Those also should be all like included in the report because they can be blockers for the game. Just because we didn't expect them and we didn't agree to talk about them doesn't mean it shouldn't go in there. So we have like always make sure you have your priority objectives answered and any major things that came up that you weren't expecting. Now, sometimes there's a lot more interesting stuff in those reports. It doesn't mean you got to scrap it because you're not presenting it initially. Usually what I would do is like I present because, like you're presenting, it's usually a pretty big group. So it also depends who you're presenting to. That's going to help you tailor the amount of detail you might want to go into. But usually the first presentation is like with all the stakeholders. So it's not a specific design team, for example, that need that level of detail. And so like you do the general presentation, you answer the main things, and then you can have a follow-up call with the specific lead designers or designers that are working on a specific feature to give them more detail. Like, okay, I found this really interesting stuff about, the weapons of this game, and like let's have a follow-up conversation because I think that could help you in the future when you need to make decisions, just to have that context of what people were saying. It wasn't something that we determined was a priority, but it came up spontaneously and it can help them. So like if the time allows, right, because sometimes depending you could be super busy, but like if you have the time, taking that time to talk to the designers, the people working on the specific features, not only helps them get a better understanding of how people are reacting, but it helps you form relationships and help your collaboration process, because, at the end of the day, it's a big collaboration and we want to make sure that we're giving people what they need, and that helps foster trust and just makes everything easier moving forward.
Yeah, yeah.
Did
I
I
think
say
the
everything?
interest, basically, because I'm going to make sure we're getting to the other questions before we run out of time. But I think to kind of summarize what you were saying, Gab, it's there's not one formula, right? There's not one format of like, I'm going to write my report in this format every single time. Maybe depending on the audience, if we're delivering information to VPs or whatever, obviously, like we've got a specific format and a specific template. But if you're doing a diary study or a usability study or a card sorting task, like there's going to be flexibility there. And again, I think that's kind of one of the important themes that we've discussed, right? Is being flexible and being able to identify what information they need and being able to say, hey, we're going to chat about these specific topics, but I'm going to give more context in the written format. Maybe that's on a internal wiki page or a PowerPoint presentation, an email, whatever. Being able to kind of cater that conversation. I think I'm gonna have we're having a podcast episode very soon about reporting, so I'm gonna push forward to the next question because I want to discuss the other stuff that you all do, right? Obviously, working on tests, running specific pieces of research, running a usability test. There's there's a lot to that, but obviously, like you're not doing that every single day. And so when you're maybe not actively working on a test, it's prepping, planning, running, what other types of projects or tasks could you be working on? Just kind of giving people an idea of, yeah, okay, what does the day in the life look like when maybe I'm not running research? Tristan.
Yeah. So uh, when you're not running research, there's a couple of things you can do and you should do. The one I really like is following up on different subjects that you might not have had the time to follow up on, whether they be discussions that the productions are having right now, whether it be the results of a previous report that you have given, seeing where the team are at now, what are the choices they've made, and seeing how you can further support their the different design teams or the different features that are still being iterated on or discussed. That's something that I really find it interesting to do, and it really, like again was saying, fosters that kind of collaboration and relationships with the designers, the directors, and people of the prod. Yeah, do you have some additional ideas?
I think what we can also do is something I've really enjoyed doing is working on like best practices. So kind of working on documentation that can serve to just improve the research process across, the whole lab. So it's like how to best make surveys. Like, okay, so I did this diary study and this is what I learned. I'm going to present it to everybody. Like, please don't do this. Probably do this, right? So there's, it's just like improving our expertise through collaboration. Again, big word, but like research is all about collaboration. Can't
Yeah.
do things alone. And just like how can we improve? So it's like we're constantly doing tests and we're learning things, but if we're not sharing that knowledge, then we're not helping each other. So there's that we can do, and also like in line of with what you were saying, like sometimes we can even go back and look at like, okay, so let's say this game has been in development for 2 years. What are the main takeaways? Like maybe just kind of doing a meta-analysis of everything we know about the game. How are people feeling about it? Or even like, look, similar games that have this type of effect and this is what people really like about them, and just kind of knowledge sharing, knowledge creation is just a thing that I think as researchers is something that interests us, like, searching for stuff, presenting them, explaining them. So I think that there's so much that we can do that's kind of research adjacent, either with the production or with the lab members, like our coworkers, where we can really just improve things overall.
Yeah. No, I think that's super important and like a really interesting thing, right? Because you can kind of have that like downtime. Like I know Gab, you were kind of transitioning in between productions for a little bit, so you were working a lot on documentation. You were helping me build training documentation for newcomers to our team, and I think there's, just also having the opportunity to reflect back from yourself what you learned, share that with your colleagues because we are in a very fortunate situation where we're a rather large team and we have a lot of people working solo or working in duos on a lot of different productions, and we can knowledge share. We can spend time. We try and spend time as a team every couple of weeks to share what everybody's working on, and people can get feedback. And obviously it your mileage may vary depending on your team size, but of course what's really nice for us is that we do have that opportunity because we have a big lab, we have a big research team, we've got a lot of qualitative researchers, right? Our team of just qualitative user research analysts is 12. And so we do have a lot of people that we can talk to and share, and everybody's working on different things. And so I think it's cool to be able to also have that opportunity and yeah, building relationships, collaborations with people, because I think that we are only as successful as good as those collaborations and relationships are. If we're not putting the time into building those, then I think sometimes that can lead to a lot of frustration as a researcher when you feel like you can't communicate well with them or you're not necessarily aware of some of the struggles that they're facing, it can have a, again, it's demotivating when you feel like, oh, I did really great research and it's not inherently a bad piece of research, it's just not what they needed. And that feels awful. And it just never it never stops feeling awful when you deliver something that you're really proud of, that you did something and you were able to overcome the disasters and the chaos of a test and delivering something that maybe it wasn't what they needed. And so, yeah, spending that time and being able to kind of learn more of the questions and, you know, work with people to be able to see like, okay, maybe it's not a test, it's a meta review or something like that.
There's something I would like to add. This is obviously very, I realized we didn't mention this, and I'm like, oh, actually, we didn't talk about this, but in our industry, like, we should also spend some time playing games, even if
Yeah,
it's not the games that we make, but like, know your product, right? Like, know,
yeah,
like, you don't have to like all the game styles. For example, I worked on a game that I would never successfully play that type of game in my life. Thank God for cheats, like for real. Like, um, so basically, but it's like get to know like when you play, what is it about the game that works for you? Like it helps you to connect one
yeah,
with like the player, but also to kind of get an understanding of like, okay, when I'm struggling in a game, how do I act on screen, for example, right? Like, so it's just like it gives you a bit more context, and it just like you also learn more about like what's the consensus right now. So let's say, for example, a tutorial. What was a good tutorial 20 years ago and what's a good tutorial today? Very different things.
yeah. No, it's a totally
So
good point.
knowing like where things are at, what the standards are, also helps us to get an idea of what people expect. So it just gives us extra context. So during your work hours, please play video games.
I feel like
Public service announcement.
I feel like maybe I've said this before.
What? Quoting Lainey.
But I think it's a really good point, right? I think it goes a
Right.
long way with the production that you're working on or competitors, right? I remember playing a lot of, I worked on Siege, that's no surprise, and playing a lot of time, spending a lot of time playing other shooters, playing, investigating, watching streams, watching YouTube videos, trying to understand, you know, like sitting, reading Reddit, like trying to understand what's going on and what people think. And that can be a whole other probably podcast episode talking about other ways of leveraging feedback and information from players and bringing that into our research. But yeah, it is as an important piece. So we're running out of time. I apologize. We've been chatting for a while, but I have one final question for both of you. You're a few years in, both of you. Well, Gab, you're about a year and a half in, close enough. There's a lot of people that are students, those trying to get into the industry that listen to this lovely podcast of ours, and they want to know, you know, like how do I, what does this position look like, and what should I know, right? And I think I would like for you to think on what advice you might be able to provide to newcomers, either just that are students or maybe those that are trying to get into roles like yours.
So I'll go first.
I know you've been
Because for
dying
me,
to answer this question the
yes, yes.
entire time.
For me, it's a no-brainer from personal experience. So basically, I think, especially when you're not from the industry, right? Let's say like I had done research in a lot of different areas before. Uh,
Like academic context,
yes,
possibly.
mostly academic context, yes. And what happened when I started is that because I felt so unsure, I felt like there was so much I didn't know. Like, what's the most important thing to look at in a video game, right? Like, what are the like metrics? We know what behavior means what. Like, you're kind of new to everything, and no matter how much you've played, because I've played a lot of games in my life, but it's just like, how do I analyze this? And so you might be tempted to measure everything. So my biggest, I think the best advice is that don't let your uncertainty force you to like measure everything, and keep your scope manageable. You'll be doing yourself a favor. Spend maybe more time speaking, to the people that work on the game, who have maybe researchers who have done previous research, or whether it be the production team themselves. Understand like what the metrics are, and don't measure all of them. Pick some. Like I learned the hard way that, you know, to feel like you're more in control, you might want to cover all the bases. And that's just going to make you drown in data and make you do way too much overtime to analyze all the
Very,
data you
very
hoarded.
proud we are here today.
Yeah.
having having to sit and watch you make these decisions and let you kind of ruminate in them for a bit.
Yes. I had to learn the hard way because I was very adamant that we needed all of this. I was like, no, all of these things. Like I was like, let's say we're measuring difficulty. I was measuring everything you could possibly measure about difficulty because I didn't know what mattered more. So I was like, but I'll have it. And that way I can just look at everything and then I'll know. But actually, it's even more confusing because like sometimes things contradict each other and then which one is real, right?
Yeah,
And
well,
so,
I think it's a very big step, right? And I know that was something that took you a bit to overcome. You have certainly done that,
whoop, whoop.
but I think it's difficult when you come from a more academic or kind of theoretical background. There are a lot of strengths in that application of research, and it can often be a surprise for a lot of people when they come in and it's like, hey, actually, I need you to measure this and I need to know what the output is tomorrow, and you can't possibly measure every single facet of difficulty. And again, yeah, it's understanding what it is actually their question. And a lot of that times it means what is the decision that needs to be made, or I know this was something that came up for me on Siege all the time. They would ask questions, but the game didn't always facilitate a way in which to fix that. So we had to really cater the type of feedback we were giving based on the levers that we knew were in the game. Because and sometimes it felt very strange because we were like only asking certain facets, and so we were really kind of trying to triangulate all of this data, but being able to say like, yeah, if you change that thing, that's probably going to help us address this issue. And for a while, like it's easy to get stuck in this uncertainty feels very difficult because you want to control everything.
Spoiler, you cannot. I have tried.
Yeah, Gab gave it a good try many
Yeah.
times, but we
Hmm. I remember.
I finally let go.
but I think that's a good lesson because I do think that it is very surprising, right? I remember feeling like, oh, wait, hold on. I need to run really fast and I need to make decisions, and sometimes you have the luxury of doing that, right? There are instances where we have pieces of research that are able to look more at the theoretical basis of a lot of these questions and challenges. It's just not always the reality in every situation and every production, and depending on what you're doing, and it's understanding that. Tristan, I'm curious as to what your piece of advice.
Yeah, so twofold. First piece of advice would be if you're hesitating to get into the industry, just do it. You don't have anything to lose. Just try it out.
All right,
Um,
there you
it,
go.
it for me it took uh, two CV sends and a waiting time of 20 days. So you can do it. Believe in yourself, and that's the first step. Second step is a little bit contradictory because my piece of advice would be if you can take your time. And I know that this is contradictory because I have one speed and it's go. Um,
This is
but
very true.
But if you're a new user researcher on a production or just in the video game industry, it goes along with everything we've said since the beginning of of this talk. Just take your time. Take your time playing games. Take your time understanding the game you're working on. Taking time to discuss with the designers, directors, what are they working on? What are their intentions? Instead of being like any researcher jumping at feet first and like let's do research. No, just breathe, get acquire the knowledge you need to get to do your job as best as possible, and then start running research once you have acquired everything that you need. If you can, of course, like you were saying, sometimes you have to
Yep.
run. There's a sprint, there's a marathon you have to run. You got to do it, but as soon as you have time, just breathe and acquire that knowledge.
I think it'll make the research much more pleasant when you do get there as well, when you do have the opportunity to kind of communicate and learn and work with your stakeholders in meaningful ways, because you'll be able to feel like you delivered a piece of research that people will care about and can act on and can move forward with. So thank you very much. I appreciate your perspective. I think there was a lot of, I think we chatted about a lot of interesting things, and I think we probably could have kept going for quite some time and touch on a lot of other topics that we had initially said we wanted to talk about. So maybe we'll have a little bit of a part two, depending on if people have some follow-up questions for us after the episode, and we'll see if we can come back and kind of tackle some more topics. But thank you both for taking the time. It's been nice to chat with you, and it's I think this will be really helpful for people to get a little bit of an understanding. So thank you for taking time out of your busy day. I know you both got things going on to chat and share your learnings with everybody. So thanks again.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thanks so much.
Great, and thank you so much. And we will see you all on the next one.
Bye.
Ciao.